Watercolor markers can be so fun and relaxing once you get the hang of them. And today I wanted to show you some tips and tricks on how to do some simple portraits using watercolor markers. My personal favorite are the Tombo brush markers, but there are so many different brands available. I recently did an illustration of my adorable niece as a Mother's Day present, and I wanted to show you kind of how I did it. While learning drawing skills is definitely going to improve your art practices, whether you're doing watercolor, acrylic, really any type of art, so I'm definitely still encouraging you to practice drawing. If you don't have those skills yet, or if you just want to do something fun and the thought of drawing stresses you out, there is a trick. So I have this photo printed out right here, and then we're going to take a pencil and shade all along the back of the paper. Then I'm going to lay the paper graphite side down on top of my watercolor paper and hold it in place, simply tracing over all the lines to get a basic outline transferred onto my watercolor paper. It's really faint, but we want that, so it doesn't show up too well in the video, but there is actually an outline there. Next, I'm going to take a permanent black liner pen. I'm using some of the finer tips, 0.005 and 0.02, because I don't want really thick, hard black lines. And so basically wherever there's pencil, I'm now tracing that over in my permanent ink. And I'm doing a really sort of wispy, broken outline because, again, I want some sort of boundary edge to hold everything together in the end, because watercolor ink does come out very kind of blurry and impressionistic, but I still don't personally want to see a really harsh outline. So I'm starting with minimal outline, and I can always add more later if I want more detail. Next, I have chosen some colors I want to use, at least 2 different colors for each area. The original photo was in color before I printed it out, so I'm kind of going based on the colorized colors in that photo. You always want to start with the background first, because you'll see as you start going that no matter how careful you are, a little bit of liquid as you start painting in and releasing the ink is going to go over the edge. And if you start with the background first, it's a lot easier to just layer over and disguise anything that goes outside of the boundary lines. I want to have a neutral color for the background, so I'm aiming for a dark gray. So I'm using this black ink, but you see I'm only laying a little bit down on the very edges. With watercolor markers, a little goes a long way, and that's the biggest mistake I see people make, is they feel like they have to fill in the whole area solid with ink, and then it's just too much. So you can work with a little bit at a time, and you can always layer back over and add more if you need to. The more water you use at once, the more sort of veiny, bleeding kind of effects you're going to get as the ink spreads out, and I actually want that for the background, so I'm using a medium-sized round brush that holds quite a bit of water. Since I want to keep this background color kind of light, when the brush gets too much ink in it, I'm rinsing it out again and then going back to spreading out the ink that's already on the paper. I'm going to let this dry a bit, and as I go forward, I'm going to work on the face next, because it's an area that's not directly touching the area I just worked on. That way we'll avoid any of the different colors bleeding into each other while it's still drying. I'm starting with a light beige for the shadows on the face, and in the blank areas in between, I'm going to scribble in some light peach color. I'm starting very pale because, again, we can always add more later, but it's hard to remove color if we accidentally made it too dark. Today we're going with the simple approach, so just having a light, a medium, and a dark color to work with for the skin is all we're going to work with today. Now I'm switching to a slightly smaller round brush, and I'm slowly brushing along the shadows first and then working into the highlights with my water. I'm tapping off any extra water on a towel first because I don't want to see a lot of bleeding for this part. I want it to be fairly smooth since it is her skin. And so I'm slowly just buffing the lights and darks together, kind of like how you'd use a makeup brush. I mean, I don't really use makeup brushes, but how I've seen people do it in videos anyway. It's the same idea. Now this looks pretty ghostly right now, but we are going to go back in and add some more darks and some warmth to the face once this dries. If a surface is wet, the marker won't really write on it at all, so it's important to let it dry before you keep adding. Now I'm going into the hair with a sort of goldenrod color and the same beige. Now this hair is going to be a lot more complicated than your traditional hair typically would be on one of these, so I'm showing an extreme example. But even with this, to simplify it, I'm just going along the edges, making curved, sort of arch-shaped streaks to imply the curls with my darker color first, which is the goldenrod, and then I'm scribbling a little bit of that light beige in the middle. Then I'm using a small round brush and starting with the edges, I'm smudging that color towards the center with some water, but I'm leaving it really light in the middle still so that I get those highlights. So there are some spots in the middle of each chunk of hair where I'm still leaving the white of the paper. Then I rinse off my brush and go back in for a final blend with just some plain water. I'm working a section at a time because if you let the ink sit too long on the paper to where it dries completely, it will still blend, but it won't blend as nicely or as easily. So that's why I'm doing it this way. Now with a warm sort of orange tone tan, I'm going to go ahead and in certain places where there's a lot of shadow, I'm going to add a little burst of this to add some warmth to the face. So I just added some streaks, and now I'm going to go in and lightly brush over the edge of those streaks with water. So I don't even necessarily need to run over the whole area of ink and spread it all out. I'm really just blurring the edge between the new color I just added and everything else, so that's a nice gradation. You'll notice this looks very orange. Ink wash portraits look funny the entire time until they're done, so you really have to trust the process. We're going to go back to it and keep adding. Next, again, to add a little bit of color and dimension, I'm adding some pink to the cheeks and the lips and just brushing over the whole area of pink I just added with water to really blend it in with the skin. Now we still need some deeper shadows, so I'm going to go in very carefully with a dark brown and add it only to the deepest shadows under her hat and under her chin around where the hand tucks under. And I'm also going to add some darker pink to the corners of her mouth. With these darker colors, again, we want to be really careful and just add a little tiny bit at a time. And then I'm brushing along the edge, again, of that color I just added. I decided to do the same thing with the hair, so wherever in my photo I see the deepest shadows in between her curls, I'm adding a streak of this dark brown and then using the same motion of making the curved lines going in towards the center of each chunk of hair. I'm just brushing that out with the tip of my wet, smaller round brush. For little details and shadows like this, the less water the better actually. So for this, I'm definitely getting any excess water after I dip my brush off on the towel first. Now with the portrait of my niece, just because of the color of her skin and hair and the way the photo was and the other colors going on in my final art piece, it was actually way less complicated than this. I only used the orange brown and the peach for her face, and I also only used two colors in her hair, the beige and the orange brown tone, rather than three colors for each like I'm doing in this one. So it all depends on the type of skin tone, the lighting, whether you have to use three colors or can get away with just two. Now for the eyes, I'm just going in with a blue and then I'm using a really small detail brush to just dot some water along the edges of that ink, and I'm just letting the ink run how it wants to basically, because naturally I'll end up with the darker areas where I first laid down the ink and also some really light areas where there's highlights naturally made from just the water and ink flowing together. I also used the fine tip end of a gray and shaded some gray under the top of the eyelid. Now we've also got to put our eyebrows back on. I still have the pencil outline of the eyebrows, which I can see through my color, and I'm just brushing over that with a light beige, and with the fine detail end of my goldenrod color, I'm adding some streaks to imply little eyebrow hairs, but her eyebrows are really light, and so I'm going to leave them that way and just kind of fade them into everything. I want to add a little more shadow to under the hat because it got washed out, and that will happen sometimes as you're blending. Some of your dark shadows you put down originally might get faded out a little bit because even after they've dried, as I said, if you add water again to these, they will dilute and run and blend over again. So this will happen where once your picture starts getting closer to being completed, you'll see areas where the balance is off and it needs more dark. Now our clothing is quite dark, so the two colors that I'm using for clothes are a really, really dark gray, almost black, and a color that's close to a navy blue. I added the dark gray to all the shadows I saw in the original photo, as well as where I had traced the wrinkles in the jacket where there were some shadows. Then I used the blue to scribble in the other areas, again, still leaving a lot of white space because a little bit of ink goes a long way when I spread it out with the water. You can see I'm really just scribbling. That's why these things are magic. Now, because I'm going just for flat, even coverage, I'm switching to a flat brush, which are the kind of brushes that are rectangular shaped and flat on the end. And I'm spreading across, starting with my dark and going into the blue area and blending them together with water. Every so often, I'm rinsing off my brush to get the excess ink off so that it doesn't get too dark. You can see that in between where I laid the ink down, natural highlights are created. Now with her hat, it's the same process. There's a lot of shadow, just like on the jacket, and I'm filling that in with the dark gray and scribbling in between in the other blank areas with the blue. Last, we just add the details. So I'm adding a little more beige where it needs more shadow in the face. This you don't even necessarily have to blend with water again. You can just use the natural brush shape of the marker to fill in a stroke or two as needed. And I'm also adding a little more pink to the lips and cheeks. Then I'm going to use my pen to add the eyelashes. And you don't want to draw big individual eyelashes because that'll end up looking cartoony. So what I did was I scribbled a little bit along the edge of the eyelid, and this made some little jagged streaks. And it's done. So I picked a really hard picture to do this demo without really meaning to. So as I said, for the piece of art I did of my niece, it actually wasn't this complicated, and I didn't have to use so many colors and so many layers of blending. So I do encourage you to try this, knowing that I've showed you a more difficult process than it likely will be. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, drop me a comment or shoot me a message if you have any questions. I'm always here to help. Thank you.